A couple weeks ago, we announced the new series, A Summer of Scots. And the first video in this series is going to be the diary and life of Andrew Bonar. This is also the first book that I read of one of the Scottish divines, especially of the 19th century. And so it's very special to me. This is the newer edition. The first one I read was from the 1950s. But this is a 470-page book. It's 420 pages with an appendix and an index. If you're new, let me welcome you to Petra Publications. My name is Davis, and here on this channel, I mostly just review Reformed Christian books. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, I'd love to have you join us by subscribing. And if you've been following for a while, links in the description down below to our donation and subscription page on our website. Thank you so much for your support. I don't want to give too much information about Andrew Bonar because this book, this beautiful purple Banner of Truth book, is the entire story of his life, beginning in college years all the way to his death. But I will say that Andrew Bonar was born in 1810 and he died in 1892. He's best known as the author of A Commentary of Leviticus, the biography of his dear friend Robert Murray McCheyne, and the Letters of Samuel Rutherford, in which he edited and also wrote a short sketch of Rutherford's life. Let's go ahead and dive into the book review proper. I'll just start off by saying that journals are one of my favorite form of biographies, and it's also one of my favorite types of book in general, which automatically puts this book in the top list of my favorites. I disagree with some of Andrew Bonar's doctrine, such as his clear dispensational premillennialism throughout this entire book, but it doesn't drive me away from his work in general. And another issue he had, especially at the beginning of the book, and you'll find this very soon after reading it, is that despite his clear love and faith for Christ, he doubted his salvation over and over and over again. And so here he is at college, studying to be a minister, questioning whether he's even saved, praying to the Lord to save him, and he's looking for something that I'm not even sure exists. I don't know what he was looking for, but the first 30-some pages deal with this every day, writing about and about his emotion and his feelings towards God and how he was cold and hard against him, even though he knew him to be true and believed in him. And the verse that kept coming back to my mind as I read this, and I read it, I think this is the third time I've read this book, but every time that comes up, I just think about John 3:16, right? Whoever believes in him shall have faith, or shall have everlasting life, right? Well, I butchered that, but you know the verse, John 3:16, and so every time he doubts his faith and says, I'm not sure if I'm saved, I just keep thinking that verse in my mind, and I'm not sure how that worked out. But even still, the book is really wonderful. And in all of this, instead of making this book and his other books that we'll be reviewing in this series one that I put down and don't finish, but rather make me appreciate the work that God did through him despite his faulty doctrine. A couple months ago, we looked at some of Hudson Taylor's work. And if you want a flawed man, you can look at Hudson Taylor. Some of his doctrine is wild, right? But God used him, and he touched him, and he worked through him despite his faulty views and his sinful lifestyle. And Bonar is much the same. He had a strange theology. And you can look at the same thing 100 years prior to him, to the both of them, with, John Wesley or Charles Wesley, right? Really weird theology. But God used them and worked through them, and it's a constant reminder to me that God can work through me despite my strange theology and my sin. And so, again, a book that is a constant reminder of God's grace and mercy towards mankind. Bonar was a great man of prayer, and God answered his prayers. And I want to read a quote on page 11, of the introduction. It says, "The main lesson we learn from the life of Andrew Bonar, as indeed from all the great saints of God, is that what is real in the life of man has more affinity with the solitude of the closet than with the stir of the outward things. If reality and religion is to be reached again by the present generation of Christians, then the outward must occupy less of our time and the inward more. There must be more privacy than Christians seem now to think needful. There must be more waiting upon God in the secret place. There must be more unbroken fellowship with the Father and the Son. And so Andrew Bonar was a man of prayer, and he believed, just like Hudson Taylor that we looked at a few months ago, or last month at some point, just like Hudson Taylor, his prayer life was what drove him and what God used to use him. And again, just a constant reminder that we have what they had. They are human beings just like we are, and so God can use us just as he used them. But back to the contents of this book. The book is split into two main sections, the diary and the reminiscence of his life. Or I guess the word would be pronounced reminiscences, but that's really hard. Reminiscence, I can't say it. Reminiscence of his life. So it starts with an introduction, and then it moves to a preface. Then it goes to his diary, the conversion in college life, that's 1828 to 1834, work in Jedburgh and Edinburgh, 1835 to 1838, Collis, 1838 to 1856, early years in Phineaston, 1857 through 1863, ministry in Glasgow, 1864 through 1875, and then labors more abundant, 1876 through 1888, and then finally the closing years, 1889 to 1892. Then it moves to the reminiscence of his life, chapter 8, a minister of Christ, the good pastor, in the city, echoes of spoken words, a basket of fragments, among his people, man's memoirs, nearing the goal, and finally faith and doctrine. And then there's an appendix, Andrew Bonar's introduction to Nettleton and his labors, and then as I mentioned earlier, there's an index. So those are the table of contents. Normally at this point, I would say, ask the question, would I buy this book? And I absolutely would, given the caveats I've already given, understanding that this is the man's journal, so there are a lot of things in here that are private and sensitive to him, and you get to see him for who he truly is. And so I would absolutely buy it, especially if you're going to read the books that we'll be reviewing later in this series. I would definitely recommend purchasing and reading this book. But I will now go into some quotes from this book to give you an idea of what's inside. The first quote comes from page 12, Roman numerals, of the introduction. It says this, he's being quoted here, "Doctrine is practical, for it is that which stirs up the heart." And right from the very beginning, you get a taste of how he writes and what he believes. Page 11, he says this, "Earthly affections and desires sometimes assail me, but God, by giving me joy in divine things in the absence of all I wished from the earth, has shown me that there is better happiness." That's very good. Page 15, here's something I disagree with. Let me get there. This is humorous to us today, probably, and a good reminder that this is not the case now. "Believing in the speedy coming of Christ, I thought it comforting to look upon diseases such as this influenza that is cutting off many as one of the last diseases of this world." Again, the premillennialism, the dispensational premillennialism is just flowing off the page, but sort of skip past that kind of stuff, and there's really, really good things in here which I will be sharing with you in just a moment. At page 41, he says this, "More and more convinced, by the very want of it, that the way to be successful is within the sanctuary of God, and then come out to the people." Page 45, he says, The secret of true and complete composure is just feeling God behind all things going on. At the same time, God himself must be the fullness of everything. And this is a great, great reminder today that God is behind everything. On page 69, he writes about the death of Robert McCheyne. And from this point forward, his whole journal shifts. It changes. And he writes constantly about his memories of McCheyne and his bitterness and sadness, his sorrow that his dear, dear friend had passed. The only other thing that affected him so drastically was the death of his wife, which he also writes a lot about in his journal here. On page 90, he refers to his commentary on Leviticus, and then later he says, "Conscious of backsliding, I sought last night the Lord's return, and got a sweet sense of complete forgiveness for the past. That glance gave me great strength." Again, it's praying, it's prayer. He's in his closet, he's seeking God, and he's reminded of the truths. He's listening to Christ. On page 115, he says this, "Prayer, prayer, prayer must be more a business than it has been." You see this constant focus on prayer, a very, very important theme in all of the great men of God. On page 161, "I am convinced that living in the spirit of prayer from hour to hour is what brings down the blessing." And here, as I've been saying this entire review, he talks about how the blessing that comes from God, oops, I just kicked my tripod, sorry about that. The blessing that comes from God is because of the prayer. And if we don't pray, there will be no blessing, right? You have to pray. I have to pray. And prayer is a weak place for me. I don't pray enough. But these books, especially in this series that we'll be doing over the summer, are a constant reminder that prayer is a vital part of the Christian faith. On page 209, he says this. I just love this alliteration here. He says, "Lord, give me light, love, life, likeness to thee." Again, that's a prayer. Page 350. He says this, "It is worthwhile being wounded to have the hands of the great physician upon you." And later, "Those who sing loudest in the kingdom will be those who on earth had the greatest bodily suffering. We pity them now, but we shall almost envy them. But then we shall almost envy them." And on page 412, he gives the 5 points of Calvinism and why they're so important. I won't read this whole passage because it's fairly long, but he talks about the person of God. This is the person of Christ in the 5 points of Calvinism. And so he says this, "Nor let us fail to notice that all the doctrines of grace are beams from the glorious person of Christ. There we may see them in their center. The person of God-man is a proclamation of election. The principle of election, inasmuch as it is an everlasting monument of his having passed by angels and come in mere grace to the help of man. And then the person of God is a proclamation of particular redemption. Later, the person of Christ is a proclamation of the doctrine of special grace. Later, the person of Christ proclaims irresistible grace. And then finally, later, The person of Christ proclaims the perseverance of the saints. And this idea of the person of the Christ and the valuable doctrines that flow from the doctrine of the person of Christ is what we'll look at next time when we take a look at the person of Christ by Andrew Bonar. That's pretty much all I have for you today. I hope that this review was helpful to you. And if it was, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section down below. Lord willing, I will see you again very soon. God bless.